The mail-order bride who was abandoned for being barren stood in her doorway. 10 children gathered around her skirts like wildflowers after rain. Jasper Thornfield held legal papers in his trembling hands. His mouth moved, but the words seemed to catch in the dry Wyoming air. "These children prove you were never barren." His voice cracked like old leather. "You deceived me." Cordelia Brightwater's hands found the shoulders of her youngest, a boy of 3 with eyes like winter sky. The other 9 pressed closer. Their faces held the same fierce protection she had learned to wear like armor. "I never deceived anyone, Jasper." Her words fell quiet as stones in still water. "You abandoned a faithful wife." The boarding house behind her buzzed with morning activity. Former slaves hung laundry that snapped in the wind. Unmarried mothers tended gardens that had once been barren ground. Women who had nowhere else to go had made this place into somewhere. Jasper's new wife sat in their carriage, her pregnant belly round beneath her traveling dress. Evangeline's face was pale as winter wheat, her gloved hands twisted in her lap. The townspeople gathered like crows after harvest. Mrs. Henderson from the dry goods store whispered behind her fan. The banker's wife clutched her prayer book. Men removed their hats, but their eyes held judgment sharp as glass. Dr. Samuel Hartwell stepped from the boarding house. His medical bag hung from weathered hands that had delivered every one of Cordelia's children. His presence beside her spoke louder than words. "Look at them." Jasper's voice rose higher. The papers shook in his grip. Each one different. Different fathers, different blood. The children did look different. Hair that ranged from corn silk to autumn oak. Eyes blue as summer sky or brown as good earth. Skin that told stories of heritage mixed like paint on an artist's palette. Cordelia's eldest, a girl of 9 with her mother's steady gaze, stepped forward. "We know who our father is." Her small voice carried clear as church bells. "The wind that blows through these walls, the roof that keeps us dry, the hands that feed us every morning." Jasper's face reddened like sunset. The law sees blood, not sentiment. The law sees fraud. He thrust the papers toward her. "Our marriage was annulled because you could not bear children. If you could bear them all along, then you lied. These children belong to their father's name." Cordelia took the papers. Her fingers traced the official seals. The legal words meant to bind her, break her, take everything she had built from nothing. "These children have fathers, Jasper." Her voice stayed level as horizon. "Just not you." The crowd gasped like wind through wheat. Evangeline's face went whiter still. Dr. Hartwell's jaw tightened. Jasper stepped backward as if struck. "You admit it, then? Adultery, deception." "I admit nothing but truth." Cordelia folded the papers with careful precision. "You left me in this town square 10 years ago. Called me barren as desert stone. Said I was worthless as a wife. Worthless as a woman." The memory hung between them like heat shimmer. Every person present remembered that day. The public humiliation. The annulment declared before God and neighbors. The way Jasper had ridden away without looking back. "You have 1 week." Jasper climbed into his carriage. 1 week to prepare for a legal hearing. These children will carry my name, or they will carry the shame of bastards. Evangeline's eyes met Cordelia's through the carriage window. Something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. The shared knowledge of what it meant to be a woman dependent on a man's mercy. The carriage rolled away through dust that settled like judgment on everything it touched. The townspeople dispersed with whispers that would feed gossip for weeks. Cordelia's children remained pressed close. 10 lives that had grown under her roof, under her protection, under love that asked nothing but gave everything. Dr. Hartwell touched her elbow, gentle as falling snow. "We need to talk." She nodded. The boarding house waited behind them. Women who had found refuge here watched from windows. Their faces showed worry mixed with determination. They had all learned what it meant to stand when the world demanded they fall. "Children, go help with breakfast." Cordelia's voice carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to command through service. "Mrs. Patterson needs wood for the stove." Miss Sarah needs help with the washing. They scattered like seeds on wind, but their eyes lingered. They understood more than children should have to understand. Life had taught them early that safety was not guaranteed, that family was not blood, but choice made daily. Cordelia entered her home with papers that could destroy everything she had built. The wooden floors creaked under footsteps that had learned to carry weight beyond their years. Sunlight fell through windows she had scrubbed clean with her own hands. 1 week to prove that love was stronger than law. 1 week to show that mothers were made, not born. 1 week to fight for the only thing that mattered in a world that had tried to convince her she mattered not at all. 10 years earlier, Cordelia had stepped off the train into dust that tasted like broken promises. Her traveling dress wilted in the heat. The photograph in her hand showed a man with kind eyes and a steady jaw. Jasper Thornfield had written letters filled with dreams of children and homesteads. The man who met her at the station wore the same face but different eyes, cold as winter stone. His handshake felt like a business transaction. Their wedding took place in a church that smelled of pine and desperate hope. Cordelia wore her mother's dress, altered to fit a body that had grown thin on train food and worry. Jasper wore his Sunday best and the expression of a man purchasing livestock. The ranch house sat on land that stretched to the horizon like a brown sea. Wind carved furrows through the grass. The rooms echoed with emptiness that no amount of furniture could fill. Cordelia learned to cook on a stove that ate wood like a hungry beast. She learned to mend clothes that the wind tried to tear apart. She learned to speak to a husband who answered in grunts and turned away in their bed. Months passed like seasons of drought. No children came. Jasper's eyes grew colder with each passing moon. He began to speak of her failure in front of neighbors, called her barren at church socials, blamed her for the empty cradle that gathered dust in their bedroom. What Jasper did not know was that Cordelia visited Ayanna in the hills beyond town. The Shoshone woman lived in a cabin that smelled of sage and secrets. Her hands were gentle as she mixed herbs that would prevent what Cordelia feared most. "Your mother died birthing you," Ayanna said, grinding roots into powder. "This fear lives in your bones." Cordelia drank the bitter tea each month. Her body remained empty by choice, not by curse. The herbs worked like a quiet rebellion against a husband who saw her only as a vessel for his legacy. 3 years of marriage felt like 30. Jasper's disappointment curdled into cruelty. He began to drink whiskey that made his words sharp as broken glass. He spoke of annulment in voices meant to carry beyond their walls. The day he left her, the whole town gathered to watch. Cordelia stood in the square, wearing her best dress and her mother's pearls. Jasper read from papers that called their marriage void, said she was barren as desert stone, worthless as a woman, a failure as a wife. The crowd watched like spectators at a hanging. Some faces showed pity, others held satisfaction at seeing pride brought low. Cordelia kept her chin high as her world crumbled to dust. Jasper mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. The papers he left behind gave her nothing but freedom she had never asked for. The house would go to his cousin. The land would be sold. She had 1 month to find somewhere else to carry her shame. That night, Cordelia walked to Ayanna's cabin. The herbs sat in their jar like small brown seeds of rebellion. She opened the jar and poured them into the wind, watched them scatter like prayers across the grass. "I want to live," she whispered to the darkness. "I want to choose my own path." With her mother's small inheritance, she bought the failing boarding house on the edge of town. The building sagged like a broken spine. Paint peeled from walls that had seen too much sorrow. But the bones were strong, and Cordelia had learned to see potential in broken things. The first month alone, she repaired shutters and scrubbed floors. Her hands grew calloused from work that had never been required of a rancher's wife. The physical labor felt like freedom. Thomas the blacksmith brought her a new lock for the front door. His hands were gentle when he installed it. He had witnessed her humiliation in the town square, but his eyes held no judgment. "A woman needs to feel safe in her own home," he said. His voice carried the weight of someone who understood what it meant to be cast aside. Dr. Hartwell came to check on her health, found her thin but determined. He left medicines she could not afford and refused payment she could not give. "Healing takes time," he said, "for bodies and hearts both." Reverend Marcus stopped by to offer spiritual comfort. His words were gentle as rain on parched ground. He spoke of redemption and second chances in voices that held no condemnation. Within 6 months, Cordelia discovered she was carrying her first child, Thomas's child, conceived in a moment of shared loneliness and desperate hope. She felt the life growing inside her like a small miracle. The town whispered when her condition became obvious, calculated dates and pointed fingers, but Cordelia had learned to wear shame like armor. She would not apologize for choosing to live. Dr. Hartwell delivered the baby on a night when wind howled like banshees, a boy with Thomas's steady hands and Cordelia's fierce eyes. She named him Gabriel, after the angel who brought impossible news. The second child came 18 months later, Dr. Hartwell's son, born from comfort given in her darkest hour. Then Reverend Marcus's daughter, conceived in a moment when they both needed to believe in grace. Each child was a deliberate choice. Each father was a man who had shown her kindness when the world showed her cruelty. They were not accidents, but affirmations. Not mistakes, but miracles. The boarding house filled with other women who had nowhere else to go. Former slaves traveling west. Unmarried mothers carrying shame like heavy packs. Widows with children and no means to feed them. Together they created something that had never existed before. A family built not on blood but on choice, on shared burdens and mutual protection, on the radical idea that love could be multiplied rather than divided. By the time her 10th child was born, Cordelia had built an empire of the discarded. Her boarding house thrived. Her children grew strong. The women under her roof learned to stand when the world demanded they kneel. Now Jasper had returned to claim what he had thrown away. But the woman he had abandoned no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had learned that strength came not from a husband's approval, but from the courage to choose her own path. The investigators arrived like carrion birds after battle. 2 men in city suits who asked questions with voices sharp as winter wind. They knocked on doors throughout Copper Ridge, their notebooks filling with whispers and speculation. Mrs. Henderson from the dry goods store spoke behind her hand about the scandal. The banker's wife counted pregnancies on her fingers and shook her head. Men gathered at the saloon to debate whether Cordelia was victim or villain. The town split like wood under an axe. Half saw a woman who had survived abandonment with dignity. The other half saw a woman who had brought shame to their respectable community. Children caught the tension in their parents' voices and carried it to school like stones in their pockets. Cordelia's 10 children felt the change like animals sensing storms. Gabriel, now 9, walked taller, but his eyes held worry. The younger ones pressed closer to their mother's skirts. They had learned early that safety was not guaranteed, that family was something to be protected. At the boarding house, women who had found refuge there moved with quiet purpose. They had all survived abandonment in different forms. Some had been cast out by families who could not accept their choices. Others had fled marriages that promised protection but delivered only pain. Sarah, a former slave who tended the garden, worked her hands deeper into soil that had learned to bloom under careful attention. Her own children played alongside Cordelia's, their laughter a defiant song against the investigators' whispers. Mrs. Patterson, widowed with 3 young ones, kneaded bread with fierce concentration. Her husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her with nothing but debts and the promise of the county poorhouse. Cordelia had offered her work and shelter. Now she returned that kindness with fierce loyalty. Dr. Hartwell made his evening rounds through the boarding house. His medical bag carried medicines for bodies and hearts both. He checked on Sarah's infant son, born with lungs that struggled for air. Examined Mrs. Patterson's youngest for signs of the fever that had taken her husband. His hands were gentle when he touched Cordelia's shoulder. They had shared the secret of her children's parentage for years. Each birth had been attended with discretion and understanding. Each child had been welcomed as a miracle rather than a scandal. "They are asking about medical records," he said quietly. "Dates of births, circumstances of conception." Cordelia nodded. She had expected this. The law required proof, and proof left trails like footprints in snow. Thomas arrived after sunset, his blacksmith apron still dusted with ash from the forge. His son Gabriel ran to greet him with the easy affection of a child who knew he was wanted. Thomas lifted the boy to his shoulders and carried him through the boarding house like a prize. Reverend Marcus came bearing fresh bread from his housekeeper and books for the children's lessons. His daughter Mary, 7 years old with her mother's fierce intelligence, recited Bible verses while he listened with pride that had no shame attached to it. One by one, the fathers of Cordelia's children made their presence known, not as men claiming ownership, but as guardians protecting something precious. They understood what Jasper did not. These children were not possessions to be divided, but lives to be cherished. The breaking point came on the 4th day. Evangeline Thornfield appeared at the boarding house door like a ghost made flesh. Her pregnant belly strained against a traveling dress that spoke of money, but not happiness. Her face was pale as morning frost. "I need to speak with you," she whispered. Her gloved hands trembled like autumn leaves. They sat in Cordelia's small parlor while children played outside. Evangeline's story spilled out like water through cracked earth. The marriage to Jasper had been arranged by families seeking advantageous connections. The pregnancy that showed beneath her dress was not her husband's child. "He cannot father children," Evangeline said. Her voice broke like glass against stone. "A childhood illness left him unable. He has always known." The truth hit Cordelia like lightning splitting sky. Jasper's abandonment had never been about her failure as a wife. It had been about hiding his own perceived inadequacy. His cruelty had been born from shame he could not admit. "He will cast me aside when he discovers the truth about this child," Evangeline continued, "just as he cast you aside." Cordelia studied the young woman's face, saw herself 10 years earlier, frightened and dependent on a man's mercy. The difference was that Evangeline carried life created in desperation rather than choice. "Why tell me this?" "Because you have something he wants to destroy, and I have something that could save us both." The knowledge sat between them like a loaded weapon. Cordelia could expose Jasper's sterility and win her case instantly, could prove that his accusations of deception were projections of his own lies, could destroy him as thoroughly as he had once tried to destroy her. But using this weapon would destroy Evangeline in the process, would leave another woman abandoned and shamed in a world that showed little mercy to the fallen. That evening, Cordelia gathered her children around the kitchen table. Their 10 faces looked up at her with trust that had been earned through years of protection and love. Gabriel understood more than the others. His steady gaze held questions he was afraid to ask. "We may be separated," she said simply. "The law sees blood, not love. It counts fathers, not families." Mary, Reverend Marcus's daughter, spoke first. "We know who our family is." The others nodded, from Gabriel down to little Samuel, barely walking but fierce in his loyalty. They had been raised to understand that belonging was not about biology but about choice made daily. "We choose you," Gabriel said. His voice carried the authority of someone who had learned early what it meant to stand for something. "Whatever comes, we choose you." Outside, wind howled through the boarding house walls like voices of the displaced seeking shelter. Inside, a family that society refused to recognize prepared to fight for the only thing that mattered in a world determined to tear them apart. Cordelia held the secret that could save them all, but using it would make her as cruel as the man who had once destroyed her. The choice before her was not between victory and defeat, but between justice and mercy, between the satisfaction of revenge and the harder path of protecting those who could not protect themselves. The town hall filled like a church on Judgment Day. Every seat held someone with an opinion about Cordelia Brightwater and her 10 children. The air hung thick with expectation and the smell of nervous sweat. Judge Morrison arrived from the county seat with law books and a reputation for fairness that cut both ways. His weathered face showed nothing as he arranged papers on the makeshift bench. The gavel in his hands carried the weight of decisions that could shatter lives. Jasper sat with his lawyer, a thin man from Denver, who spoke in legal phrases meant to confuse rather than clarify. Evangeline remained in their hotel room, claiming illness that everyone understood as shame. Her absence spoke louder than any testimony. Cordelia entered with her 10 children arranged around her like a living shield. They wore their best clothes, patched but clean. Their faces held the dignity of people who had learned to stand straight in storms. Behind them came the women of the boarding house. Sarah carried her infant son, born free, but still fighting for his place in the world. Mrs. Patterson held her youngest daughter's hand. Ayanna sat in the back row, her weathered face a map of wisdom earned through suffering. The fathers of Cordelia's children filled the next rows. Thomas the blacksmith sat with hands that had forged iron into tools of creation rather than destruction. Dr. Hartwell carried his medical bag like a shield against those who would question his choices. Reverend Marcus wore his clerical collar with the authority of a man who had found God in unexpected places. Judge Morrison called the proceedings to order. His voice carried across the room like thunder before rain. The lawyer from Denver stood first, papers rustling like dry leaves. "This case concerns fraud," he began. "A marriage annulled for barrenness that clearly was not barren. Children born to a woman who claimed she could not conceive." The legal arguments flowed like winter wind through broken shutters. Dates were presented. Medical records were demanded. The sanctity of marriage was invoked alongside the rights of fathers and the shame of illegitimate children. Then Thomas stood. His blacksmith hands gripped his hat like an anchor. "I renounce any claim to the boy Gabriel." The courtroom stirred like grass before a storm. Dr. Hartwell rose next. "I renounce any claim to the children born under my care." Reverend Marcus followed. "I renounce any claim to Mary and her brothers." One by one, each biological father stood and spoke the same words. They gave up legal rights they had never sought to claim, chose love over law, family over blood, mercy over possession. "Cordelia Brightwater earned the right to be their mother," Thomas said. His voice carried the strength of heated metal shaped by careful hands. "Through 10 years of protection, provision, and love, we were contributors to her miracle, not owners of her children." Judge Morrison's gavel remained silent. His eyes moved from the fathers to the children to the woman who had built a family from society's cast-offs. Dr. Hartwell opened his medical bag, drew out records that told stories in careful handwriting. "I have information relevant to this proceeding." The silence stretched taut as bowstring. Cordelia's heart hammered against her ribs. The secret that could save her children lay written in those medical files. The truth about Jasper's sterility, documented years before their marriage. "During Mr. Thornfield's childhood," Dr. Hartwell began, his voice steady as his surgeon's hands, "he contracted an illness that rendered him incapable of fathering children. This condition was diagnosed and documented before his marriage to Mrs. Brightwater." The courtroom erupted like a disturbed beehive. Jasper's face went red as sunset. His lawyer shuffled papers with hands that suddenly shook. The crowd whispered prayers and curses in equal measure. "You knew," Judge Morrison said. It was not a question. Jasper's silence condemned him more thoroughly than any confession. He had married Cordelia knowing he could never give her children, had blamed her for his own biological limitations, had abandoned her to hide his shame while heaping it upon her shoulders. "This court finds that the marriage was entered into under false pretenses," Judge Morrison declared, "not by Mrs. Brightwater, but by Mr. Thornfield. The annulment stands, but the accusations of fraud are dismissed." Gabriel stepped forward from his mother's side, 9 years old but carrying himself like a man grown. "We don't want his name," he said clearly. "We have our mother's name. That's enough." The other children nodded. From Mary down to little Samuel, they had chosen their allegiance. Bloodlines meant nothing compared to the bonds forged in daily love and protection. Judge Morrison's gavel fell like thunder. Custody of all 10 children remains with Cordelia Brightwater. Property rights to the boarding house are confirmed. This court is adjourned. The crowd dispersed into afternoon light that seemed brighter than before. Jasper slipped away like smoke, his dreams of reclaiming what he had thrown away scattered like dust on wind. That evening, Cordelia found Evangeline at the train station. The young woman sat on a bench with her traveling bag and her swollen belly, waiting for the eastbound train that would carry her to uncertainty. Here. Cordelia pressed an envelope into Evangeline's gloved hands. Money enough for train fare and a fresh start somewhere kinder. Your sister in California will take you in. Evangeline's eyes filled with tears that spoke of gratitude too deep for words. She had expected condemnation but received mercy instead, had feared abandonment but found rescue from an unexpected source. Why? Because breaking the cycle of cruelty is the only way it ever ends. The train arrived with steam and screaming whistles. Evangeline climbed aboard with her secrets and her hopes for redemption. Through the window, she watched Cordelia walk away into a life built on choices rather than circumstances. 5 years later, the Brightwater Home for Families stood as proof that love could grow in the most unlikely soil. The boarding house had expanded into adjacent buildings. The garden produced vegetables that fed 3 dozen residents. The children had grown into young people who understood that family was not about blood, but about the daily choice to care for one another. Gabriel worked alongside Thomas at the forge, learning to shape metal into tools of creation. Mary taught Sunday school with the same gentle authority her mother had shown. The younger children played in yards where former slaves and unmarried mothers tended flowers that bloomed despite the harsh Wyoming wind. Cordelia stood on her front porch as evening painted the sky in shades of forgiveness. Her hair showed gray now, earned through years of standing when others would have fallen. Her hands bore calluses from work that had built something lasting from society's discards. The mail-order bride who had been abandoned for being barren had given birth to more than 10 children. She had delivered a new way of seeing family, motherhood, and the radical idea that love multiplied rather than divided. That strength came not from a husband's approval, but from the courage to choose mercy over revenge, hope over bitterness, and family over blood. In a world that demanded women fall gracefully, Cordelia Brightwater had chosen to rise.